おはようございます。Permit me to speak in English. Could you permit me to be seated also?
どうぞ。
Will be more comfortable.
いや、こちら。
I thank Dr. Miyaji for your very kind introduction, and I'm somewhat awed by this occasion because I'm not used to giving lectures, and I'm not an academician, and I have no academic background to speak of. I'm not worthy probably of your audience, and so on and so on. And this is how a Japanese speaker in a completely Japanese environment is supposed to have said, apologize for one's lack of qualifications, show his modesty in speaking to such at least distinguished looking people with big whiskers or otherwise distinguished looking, and I'm supposed to apologize for my inadequate background, qualifications, lack of seniority and everything. You're supposed to apologize first. But in Western environment, among yourselves, you wouldn't do that. Chances are you expect to say a joke, to break the ice between the speaker and the audience. Hence, my very favorite anecdote. This actually took place in a Japanese-American symposium on the very question of intercultural communication. An American, quite an accomplished Japanese linguist, was the moderator. He opened the meeting first by explaining that if he were a Japanese and if it were a completely Japanese meeting, he would have started with profuse apology. If this were a wholly American thing, he would crack a joke. But this is Professor John Condon, formerly, then at that time with the ICU, he said, but since this is a mixed American-Japanese meeting, let me open the meeting first by apologizing for not joking. I think this is a beautiful case of what I term an intercultural joke. It can be translated into any language. And it is a joke and it is an apology. It satisfies both cultures. That is what we are trying to aim at. And we interpreters are always conscious of these differences, sometimes very subtle, between different cultures. For example, the way you introduce people, the way you are introduced, there are marked differences. Here, Dr. Miyaji would introduce me with a few flattering words about my background and so on. And if I were speaking to a Japanese audience, I'm supposed to stand up and bow, and I'm still expected to say, ただいまご紹介いただきました村松でございます。I'm sure you all follow me. You are restating the fact that I am Muramatsu, who has just been introduced, which is something you all know. And I take it you have known about my coming here and speaking to you probably at least for the last several days, a week or so. And Dr. Miyaji has just told you that this fellow is Muramatsu. It is a well-known fact. So by your culture, this would sound like a very self-conscious, egoistic, self-aggrandizing, or publicity-minded gesture. But in Japan, you're supposed to still very humbly identify. So even the Prime Minister does it. The Foreign Minister does it. Prime Minister, for example, 2 weeks ago, appeared before the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. On that occasion, I was also interpreting. Prime Minister stands up, and after very courteous and friendly introduction by the president of the club, he would say, 私が福田武雄であります。Everything knows it. Actually, when I'm interpreting consecutively, and I'm sure you know the difference between consecutive interpreting and simultaneous or simultaneous interpreting, when Mr. Fukuda says, 私が福田武雄でございます, and looks at me, prompting me to interpret that much, you can see I have no choice. I can't fool him. I just have to say, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Fukuda, or Takeo Fukuda. He didn't say おはようございます, but I just add that. Because it sounds more natural. In simultaneous interpreting, actually, if someone like us says, 私がご紹介いただきました園田でございます。Mr. Sonoda being the 外務大臣 or Minister of Foreign Affairs. In simultaneous interpreting, I wouldn't bother repeating that name. Instead, I would simply say, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your kind introduction, and get by with it, which sounds far more natural. And to do otherwise would simply not lubricate our communication. The way we interpret is, we interpret not words per se, but what the person means to say and how he would have said it had he been able to say it in English. This is one principle. But yet there's a danger to it. An interpreter is not supposed to explain the speaker. An interpreter should read your mind and try to be very sympathetic to what you're trying to communicate to the other party, and phrase your Japanese or English version such a way as to really convey what you're trying to say with a very comparable tone, nuance, level of intensity or lack of intensity, and so on. But if you overdo it, you are editing it. And the professional interpreter never edits. We say we should not add, we should not subtract. Now, there's a difference between the way professionals interpret and non-professionals interpret. By non-professionals, I mean perhaps the kind of people you might one day become. I'm assuming that you are not endeavoring to become professional interpreters, but in your future career, at one time or another, you may be expected or asked or ordered to interpret. Suppose you are an employee of a certain Australian-Japanese joint venture firm and interpreting for your boss, the managing director, maybe an Australian, and your Japanese customer, counterpart. You are a part of that company, and you have your own, perhaps by then, let's hope, some executive responsibility and duty. You are an interested party, you're an involved party. You have a natural interest in the subject. You're interested in the successful conclusion of this sales contract or something. You do take part in this exercise. So when you interpret for your non-Japanese speaking Australian boss, you may feel necessary, and perhaps you should to some extent amplify his words and explain what he's trying to say to his Japanese customer or potential client, and vice versa. When the Japanese say a few things, you may be expected to explain what this gentleman really means to your Australian boss. I think on occasions you would have to do that. Professionals never should do it, never. We don't interject our own thought. Sometimes it does happen that we feel we know a little more than this speaker, inevitably. But we don't show it, and our performance should not show it. We should know the subject, we should understand the background quite well, so that we can really do precise rendition, a very meticulous job every nuance, but without expanding on it, without summarizing it, no digestion, no digesting, no contraction, no expansion. We say if a guy says something silly, we should interpret it into an equally silly statement. And to do justice to all our clients, when a person says something very elegant or eloquent, we should render it equally elegantly and eloquently. So to say that if your client says something stupid, and you should do it stupidly, you should do him justice too. If he says something very wise, you should be able to render it in a very equally wise fashion, so that the other party, the audience, be it a single individual or a whole Australian ministerial delegation, will be able to make their own assessment of the speaker, quality, his personality, his tone, his psychology, and everything. Our job is bridge in this intercultural communication. Now, since our time is limited, I suggest I talk for maybe 10, 15 more minutes and throw the floor open for questions, because I'm sure you have some particular questions. And although I'm not good at presenting a well-structured piece, not being a scholar here again, I do have a lot of practical on-the-job experience, therefore a lot of interesting cases, anecdotes, funny experiences, which might be at least amusing, if not instructive. So I do like to receive your question later. Very briefly, I like to talk about basic technique, what the different types, training required, aptitude, and a little bit on the nature of this professional career, because you probably in the future will be more like our clients than our colleagues or competitors. About techniques, basically there are two types: consecutive interpreting, simultaneous interpreting. And there is a variation of simultaneous interpreting, which is called whispered interpretation. Some of you may have heard Foreign Minister Sonoda on radio yesterday. Actually, a radio station man came to interview Mr. Sonoda, and I was simultaneously interpreting Mr. Sonoda's answer into English, which was the broadcast version. His questions in English, I interpreted in a whispered fashion into Mr. Sonoda's ear. Consecutive interpreting. A lot of people think consecutive is easy, simultaneous difficult. Not true. For those of us who have, to some extent, mastered the art, or I should say, learned the art of simultaneous interpreting, we have all discovered that some type of consecutive interpreting can be far more difficult and demanding than simultaneous. Because in consecutive fashion, you have to take notes, which involves some memory, and an ability to restructure the whole thing, whether it was only 1 minute thing or 10 minutes talk. You have to be able to represent the whole thing in precisely the same tone, same fashion, same order. This involves public speaking ability, the presence of mind. You shouldn't get stage fright or anything. For example, when you face, as I did, the whole press corps, Australian and Japanese, last evening, when I get stuck for a word, which does happen sometimes, you shouldn't become nervous. If you for 10 seconds, you very easily lose the confidence of your audience. From that point on, even when your job is all right, even when you're interpreting basically accurately, people don't trust you. Well, maybe that interpreter is not good. And when they hear something that they hadn't expected, they tend to blame it on interpreters. On the other hand, if you have good basic aptitude, good cadence, trained public speech, good choice of words, command vocabulary, and so on, very soon your audience has developed complete confidence in the interpreter. From that point on, even when an interpreter occasionally goofs or just couldn't find the right phrase and paraphrase a couple of times, and if it's transcribed verbatim, it may sound, it may look a little odd, it may need a little editing job, but right there on the spot, you sound perfect. The confidence is quite important. And also another difficulty in consecutive interpreting, say for press conference, is what Australian newspapers or journalists quote are not the words that the Japanese Prime Minister or Foreign Minister said, but the words that I have chosen on the spot in my best judgment, and they end up in your headlines. And if I say something slightly wrong, that might be exaggerated, blown up out of proportion, and it could even cause widespread misunderstanding, even friction and tension. We are therefore very nervous when we do press conference interviewing. The Australian Department of Foreign Affairs asked if it could be done simultaneously because time is short. The Australian newspapermen had to beat the deadline or something. I advised them against it. Because in every press conference, unless it's a very non-political, non-controversial thing, like a certain scholar telling the press about new discovery, it can be very informal. But press conference, political nature, the speaker naturally, carefully chooses his words, idioms, and even his voice tone. For example, since this was a public occasion, I can repeat this to you. Mr. Sonoda, for example, repeatedly used オーストラリアの立場はよく理解します。Note the emphasis on よく. He didn't simply say オーストラリアの立場よく理解します。Which doesn't sound sincere, but he is sincere. He means sincerely to convey to the Australian people that we very well appreciate your position, some of the difficulties you had in your manufacturing industry, etc. So I'm expected to interpret that tone, よく. Therefore, I would use an expression like, I fully appreciate the difficulties facing Australian industries and so on. Instead of simply translating the word 理解します into I understand. If I simply say, I will understand the difficulties, I don't think it sounds sincere. So we are interpreting really tone. And that tone is picked up by those wise people in the press, and they say, the Japanese foreign minister, really sympathetic. Now, in simultaneous interpreting, there are different elements involved. Quick response, being alert, is very important. There is very little element of memorizing involved. It is not true that you simply interpreting or translating words so that you don't remember the content. That is not true. You must understand the subject. You must understand the background. You must be well prepared. And you must become an alter ego of the speaker. For example, when Prime Minister Fraser joined the meeting yesterday at about noon and stayed for more than half an hour, close to an hour, and he made some eloquent statement. When I was interpreting him into Japanese simultaneously, I placed myself in his shoes. I become his second ego, alter ego. Unconsciously, I'm speaking Japanese as if I were the Prime Minister of Australia, having certain political background which he has, knowing that there was a Labour Party in power before, and he has some message to Japanese to take home and so on. In other words, I should sound like the Australian Prime Minister. And the audience is looking at Mr. Fraser, listening to my voice, but they don't notice me. An interpreter in this instance, of course, is necessary evil. But once they know, as they have known me for some time, that this interpreter always does a good job, they don't particularly notice me. They don't look at me. They listen to my voice and look at Mr. Fraser's face and nod at him, stare at him, and so on. When the presence of interpreter is not noticed, that's the ideal situation. Here, quick response is more important than simple memory function. Oral facility to be able to convey nuance, even some humor, jokes. In other words, you have to be a good storyteller yourself to be a good interpreter. Hence, I do spend a fair amount of time listening to rakugo, the classical funny tales. Because in this art of storytelling, particularly funny stories, there's this aida no ma, pause, a very delicate art. A fraction of a second of pause can be very effective. Many young interpreters tend to just rattle off, following words and sentences and repeating in Japanese or in English every word he or she hears and think it's simultaneous interpreting. Not really. Sometimes some of the unnecessary words, this is not editing, but words that don't need to be repeated as such words can be blended into the whole phrase. This is, I emphasize, not editing, but instead of, as I said, translating words or even sentences, we try to reproduce the whole thought and tone. One very frequently asked question is, how can you simultaneously translate English into Japanese or vice versa when sentence structure is so different? You don't have the verb until the end of sentence in Japanese. Very basic and simple answer is, forget the so-called parts of speech, inshi. If you feel a noun has to be translated as a noun, there's no way to do it. Forget it. In other words, whereas in English you may start, I think that, don't think that you have to say watashi wa and wait for the end of the whole sentence. To omoimasu. You may forget, think. You may end up saying don't think or believe or disapprove. Instead, if you change that think verb into noun, you can say watashi no kangai wa. It is that simple, basically. Of course, when interpreters work, we are not thinking of those formulas. We more or less do this unconsciously. A verb can easily be expressed by a noun, noun by a verb, and so on. And as you may have learned, we have a lot of flexibility in expressing ourselves in Japanese, word orders. Not dissimilar to Latin, I imagine. And also in spoken language, tone and voice, accent, intonation can tell a lot of different stories. So this is essential characteristic of simultaneous interpreting. Training, we have a training course that we run ourselves. We have a certain reasonably well organized curriculum. It has a room for improvement. But we basically have 20-week course and only two evenings a week, 2 hours each. Many people who are working in daytime come here, and there are some students. And we have 1 semester for elementary course and another semester for intermediate. And those who successfully finish intermediate, we accept as apprentice or trainee, give them on-the-job training. We start them with a very easy job and always with more experienced veteran in a sort of buddy system in the military organization. But then this course is expensive. It has to be, because it takes some expensive instructors. There are many schools in Japan, that claim they teach simultaneous interpreting, and they say veteran instructors and so on. Most of them, I must say, are, being from downtown Tokyo, I tend to be very honest, and I'm tempted to call them fakes, but I shouldn't. I don't believe what they advertise. We don't advertise very much, but people still come to us, and we give the candidates a very exhaustive test over 2 days, altogether about 4 hours, testing their basic aptitude. And we have to charge them fairly high examination fee, 10,000 yen actually, to discourage people who are not really seriously interested. And we still end up with enough students. Actually, when I say enough students, enough for this training course to be economically or commercially viable proposition. There are a lot of people who like to take this course at any cost, and no matter what, they say, no, I don't think I can become an interpreter, but I have to try. We'll let these people try. And I always tell them at the beginning of the course that there is no guarantee that you can become an interpreter. You may repeat this course 3-4 times, you may pay million yen tuition, I cannot guarantee you. You do your best, I'll do our best. And when you find out, or when I find out conversely, that you simply don't have basic aptitude, better change your direction. It takes courage, but it's like climbing a mountain. When you think it's dangerous, the most courageous act is to go back. Now that brings me to this aptitude. To become a good professional interpreter, consecutive or simultaneous, is a question of aptitude to about 50% of the success. Now when I say 50%, and the remaining 50% is your effort, now this is actually public relations. I honestly believe it's 90% question of aptitude. I've known people who have been interpreting for more than 10 years, never becoming good interpreters. On the other hand, in some extreme instances, I've seen a person who had never interpreted this simultaneously, but was able to do it almost within a few hours. Of course, he's not as smooth as others, but in a matter of a few days, he finds out the basic trick. He has a knack for it, and he can soon develop into a fairly good interpreter. And the rest is how seriously he studies the subject matter, try to improve techniques. Like you have to be well-read in contemporary affairs. Understanding current economic problems is essential, and basic principles of economics, quite essential to reach a certain level of interpreting proficiency and go beyond that. International political affairs, you should read. But reading daily journals, newspapers, and magazines, and some serious books from time to time is quite essential. About the nature of this career, there is very good market for only very good interpreters. We have about 35 interpreters enrolled with us, actually registered with us by contract. We operate like a business firm, law firm, partnership. We're basically owned by some of our partners. Some of our senior interpreters own equity positions. And we contract our work from a client, be it Australian Department of Foreign Affairs or Japanese Gaimusho or Academic Society or whoever. And we agree that we will do this conference, we'll do this lecture, we'll do interpret for this seminar. And we select our interpreters, and we'll provide the entire service as a package. We are, and I am ultimately responsible for the performance. Among 35, about top dozen are classified Class A interpreters, and about equal number of Class B, and the rest are Cs and some apprentices. Of the dozen A's, I would say 6 or 7 are the ones I would readily take with me to summit meetings. The one taking place in Bonn, Germany middle of July. Last one was at 10 Downing Street, a year ago in May. I went there with two others. I started with Rambouillet, San Juan, and so on. Interpreters usually outlast the political leaders. Perhaps that's enough of an opening remark, and may I invite your questions.
Thank you. Do you have any question?
Yes.
Excuse me. How many languages generally would, say, the top interpreters be expected to?
Only two. No more. No more. This is a very good point. I speak Japanese fairly fluently, I think, and English with reasonable fluency, as far as non-native English speaker can go, I believe. I can get by as a tourist in perhaps half a dozen other languages. I have collected phrases and words as a hobby. Whenever I go to the Spanish-speaking country, I like to try my Spanish. Aquí está mi pasaporte, puedo pasar, and so on. But I don't try to go beyond that, because that will take my time away, and I should concentrate my efforts into perfecting is the wrong word, because you can never be perfect in English, but improving my understanding English, deep cultural background, and so on. I don't have time to flutter with other languages. And really good interpreters, as far as Japanese interpreters are concerned, should be only bilingual. Yes, ideally, if we can develop some trilingual Japanese interpreter, Japanese English. Such is a very rare animal. Such is a very rare animal. Whereas, on the other hand, for these multi-language conferences like the London Summit, Bonn Summit, there are plenty of European interpreters who handle English, French, German, Italian quite easily. Many of them are trilingual and even quadrilingual. There in Europe, bilateral interpreters have very little market. You really have to be trilingual at least. And as long as they interpret French or Italian, German into good English, we can take relay from them. This is what we call the relay system, using English as a pivot or key language. Surprisingly, there is very little time delay. 1, 2 seconds, 3 seconds from German, French, or Italian into English, and 1 to 3 seconds from English into Japanese, and vice versa. When I do simultaneous between English and Japanese, I consider 3 seconds delay too late. I try to finish within a second or two by reading the mind of the speaker, by the way. Now, back to your question. As long as there are good European language interpreters, and as long as we do a good job between Japanese and English, there is very little need for direct Japanese German, Japanese Italian, Japanese French interpreters. Such interpreters can be of use, bilingual interpreters can be of use only for bilateral conferences. Franco-Japanese, German-Japanese, which meet maybe once a year. And the market is so small, demand is so small, hence never good supply. The rules of market forces really govern here. Where there is no demand, there is never good supply, good quality supply at least. Unfortunately, therefore, for people who are living in Sydney or even in Paris, the Japanese, they may have some very good basic aptitude. They may be able to do some interpreting, but they can never become as proficient as we are, because we living in Tokyo are taken all over the world, to Rio de Janeiro, to Canberra, to Bonn, and our clients are willing to bring us. So it's not so much a question of how many languages I speak, but how well I command the two languages, which are my tools of trade. Yes?
I have two questions, if I may, sir. One concerns interpretation and translation at technical conferences, chemical or physics. As a former delegate to Australian delegate to some of the conferences in Europe, I tended to find that it was easier to listen to the French or German than try and follow the interpreter, because in a lot of cases they weren't technically oriented and failed to miss the technical aspects. That's the first point. What is the general training for, say, a technical interpreter? The second one is when you're interpreting for someone who is reasonably fluent in the language himself, but for national pride or something, but he has to use his own language. There is a story that Ho Chi Minh used to always interrupt his interpreters because basically he knew, in a lot of cases, better English or French than the people who were interpreting for him. Do you often find this sort of thing?
Yes. First, on technical conferences. For example, last May we had an international congress of ophthalmologists in Kyoto, a big thing, attracting over 4,000 ophthalmologists from all over the world. We had to service 4 concurrent sessions. That means 4 separate conferences, regardless of the size of participants, number of participants. Therefore, we had 4 teams of interpreters, each comprising 4 interpreters, 16, only between Japanese and English. Then we brought from Europe 4 teams to handle English, French, Spanish. Now, for this, we started training or preparatory study on ophthalmology as far back as January. We carefully programmed this study course. We told the interpreters, since you're handling this Kyoto Congress, you have to study this. Everybody takes this very seriously. At an interval of every other week or so, we would invite Japanese ophthalmologists who are fairly bilingual. And first lecture we heard was, what is ophthalmology? What is the eye, an eye? He would bring some visual aids, draw a picture of an eyeball, a socket, and explain in Japanese at this stage that a human eye is really comparable to camera. The socket is the metal external container for camera. Your eye is, your eyeball is lens, and so on. We learn the basics. And then as he goes along, by the way, this is called such and such in English. So we learn the substance together with technical terms. Trying to mechanically remember technical terms is at least boring and meaningless. On the other hand, if you learn something about eyes, it becomes all the more interesting. You begin connecting with a certain part of your anatomy with a certain disease. If you don't know what the duodenum is, it's not interesting at all. But if you learn where that is located, what kind of shape it is, what function it does, it becomes interesting. Liver, well, if you learn something about function of liver and learn that in Latin or Greek it's a hepa, and suddenly hepatitis begins meaning something to you immediately. And therefore, learning, remembering what pancreatitis means becomes very easy when you understand what pancreas is. So we do very thorough background study on that technical subject. Unfortunately, in Europe, you had the service of not probably the best of the interpreters. Many European interpreters are rather blasé in their professional attitude. There is this mentality in this profession. We have successfully avoided it in Japan because most interpreters in Europe and America are freelancers. They don't have a sense of belonging. They don't have a sense of identity. They're always frustrated. And yet they're interpreting for important people. And they're never recognized socially. They're nothing. And in Europe, besides, there are plenty of multilingual people, dime a dozen. And they develop a strange psychological attitude. And they say, I know the best, all the same old stuff about the ophthalmology. Oh, I can interpret that stuff without preparation. Japanese interpreters take our job far more seriously, by the way. Now, a related point is, strange it may seem, those highly technical scientific conferences are far easier to interpret than political things like this ministerial meeting. Simply because scientists talk straight. Politicians usually do not. With all my due deference to those eminent, prominent political leaders, I think it is their job, very often, to be vague. So I'm not criticizing them at all. I daily criticize my clients. But scientist may not be an eloquent public speaker. He may be very awkward in phrasing his question. But when a scientist, an ophthalmologist, asks a fellow ophthalmologist from Germany a question, he's sincerely seeking an answer. And the German ophthalmologist is sincerely trying to share his knowledge with his Japanese colleague, right? And in scientific conferences, terms are used with precise meaning. For one term, there's usually one exact equivalent in another language. No room for guessing or trying to read between the lines. But this is not the case in the political conferences. When one says like, よく理解します, there's no one fixed translation for 理解する. There's a famous how to translate phrases like 前処します. Do they know? Not yet. You might ask Professor Miyaji for more explanation about things like this. Zen is like Zen Buddhism, meaning simply good in this instance. Sho is shorisuru, to dispose of, take care of. Literally, it would mean we will take favorable action, or we will do it favorably. But in whose favor, it is left unsaid. We always ask, how do you translate Mr. Muramat's Zensho shimasu into English? I always say there's no one fixed way to translate that. Depends on the context. Depends on who is saying it, to whom, with what kind of tone, what kind of facial expression, and on what kind of subject. About beef quotas, and Australian car import restriction and so on. It's quite difficult. You really have to read the lines and try to convey the precise nuance into another language. So those political conferences are far more difficult than straight scientific conferences. So I usually let young fledgling interpreters to do technical conferences. But the summit meetings are strictly for solid professionals. Some of our interpreters, most of our interpreters are actually women. The really good ones are now around age 30, and they are the ones 30, 35. They are the ones I will take to the summit meeting. They are really sophisticated people, very intelligent, and they read a great deal. And when they reach a certain stage, they suddenly discover that they should go back to some, for example, basic textbooks on international economics. What governs supply and demand? What is, for example, elasticity curve, and so on. Beyond you, when you reach certain level, understanding these things will really give you the necessary booster to rocket you into the further stage of proficiency. Now, to cover your second question, there are people who are quite fluent in another language, namely, for example, President Giscard d'Estaing and Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. I have heard them speak quite good English, but for understandable reason of national pride, President Giscard d'Estaing doesn't speak English publicly. I think I can tell you this much without breaching any confidence, that in some summit meetings, the President of the French Republic would say things like, well, gentlemen, shall we retreat to lunch? He can say that, perfect English. But otherwise, he sticks to his native language. Germans are quite different. They're not as proud or chauvinistic about these matters. Chancellor Schmidt freely changes from German to English. I think it's all right for these people. Sometimes the way they speak English, not these two particular individuals, not very good. I've heard a certain Italian politician try to speak himself, to speak in French with apparently, I don't understand it, apparently with a very heavy Italian accent. The interpreter who was supposed to interpret French back into Italian wasn't working because she thought he was speaking Italian. So there are dangers. And I think you should, provided you have the service of good professional interpreters, you should stick to your native language. This was the case with Ambassador Raishawa, formerly Ambassador of the United States in Tokyo. He's quite comfortable in Japanese, and some of the subjects he is an expert of, he can speak fairly well in Japanese. But for public appearance, he prefers to speak in English and use his official interpreter. I think that is being wise. President Carter, by the way, speaks with very heavy Georgian accent. And he talks fast, unlike most Southerners. Southerners usually drawl. They may have thick Southern accent, but they are usually slow. That's one consolation. Mr. Carter is very fast. And before I went to London summit, I had listened to many of his tape-recorded speeches and press conferences to tune myself. And I had interpreted for him before when he was in a conference in Kyoto as governor of Georgia. Funny thing happened in the London summit. That was Mr. Carter's first participation in that international exercise. He was new to the king. And everybody was quite interested in how he would speak. Mr. Schmidt, Chancellor Schmidt, who normally listened to any other English-speaking foreign heads of government, was not wearing his earphone for German interpretation. When Mr. Carter opened his mouth, for a moment there was a look of total disbelief on the Chancellor's face. He couldn't hear what Carter was saying. He desperately groped for his earphone on his table and quickly wore it. And Mr. Schmidt was a Fulbright student, something when he was young, so he's quite fluent in English. But it was so difficult for him to understand, for anybody else to understand Mr. Carter. Incidentally, while Mr. Carter was, while Mr. Fukuda was speaking in Japanese, Mr. Carter was listening to Mr. Fukuda's substance through my voice while keeping his eyes on a couple of nice-looking lady colleagues in my booth. And you all know what he may have had in his mind. Yes?
Professor Alfonso said to me that one should not interpret out of one's native tongue. Whereas in your case, for example, you should not interpret into English. Do you agree with that?
I do. Yes, I sincerely agree. But I interpret into English because there are no native English-speaking people who have such thorough understanding of Japanese and the basic technique to do it as well as I or we can do. Ideally, people like yourselves, or some of the people I'm speaking to this afternoon, become good interpreters. They should do it from Japanese into English. Yes, I do agree fully. But for the time being, for the want of such people, we do it both ways. And I was happy to hear someone say that when my English interpretation of poor Mr. Sonoda's answers were broadcast yesterday, he thought the English was fluent enough. I think perhaps my English is fluent enough. I do have my usual Japanese difficulties with some vowels and sometimes L's and R's, but as long as I make sense clearly, and I can be fairly articulate if needs be. On the other hand, in quite informal environment, I don't talk like this. I usually go back to very comfortable American English with a bit of Virginian accent, they tell me, because I lived in Arlington, suburb of Washington for many years. But I'm used to speaking professionally with this kind of very neutral English. Yes, I do agree with that proposition.
So, during your interpreting career, there must have been some of your clients that you've got to know pretty well. And from time to time, they must have said things that they either may not have intended to, or that you know are definitely wrong. Are there any ways in which you can assist them?
Yes, when it is obviously a slip of tongue, we must automatically correct it. Many years ago, a certain minister, Japanese minister, I mean political minister, not religious. This is, by the way, very difficult. When someone starts talking about, let me tell you about an anecdote about a minister. If he's a church minister, it's one word, bokshi. If he's a minister of a cabinet, it's daijin. If he's a minister attached to a foreign embassy, it's koshi. How do we know? We have to just take a guess, make a guess, and risk. I hope it's right. Now, what was the question? Yes. Now, what was the question?
Ways in which you can
That's
assist.
a correcting question. Yes. Pardon me. I tend to deviate from my talks and over-amused myself. When you brisk, yes, when it's an obvious tongue of simple tongue, like this Japanese minister in Canada-Japan ministerial meeting, in a dinner meeting, he was giving a speech, and he obviously meant to emphasize the importance of bilateral Canadian-Japanese relationship. All the time he was saying America, America, America. See, to the Japanese, you can understand. America looms far larger as the most important partner, trade or politically or otherwise. And he didn't mean to say Canada, but he said, この度、米国へ参りまして、having come to the United States of America this time, I've been impressed by the vastness of your country, America. And all the time I was traveling to Canada. For me to do otherwise, like repeating the United States of America, sick in parentheses, would be very mean to the speaker, unfairly mean. I don't think it's right. A few times when obviously a speaker meant to say million and said billion, when I'm absolutely sure it was meant to be million, I correct it. But here again, you have to be very careful. You must be absolutely sure. Like if somebody says the population of Japan is 100 billion, oh, I wouldn't. Translate verbatim, I would say 100 million, 1億人, because it's a fact. It's obviously simple tongue. On the other hand, if you're not so sure, you don't edit it, you don't correct it. Because the very error he made may have been intended or may have otherwise revealed his psychology, in which case the audience wants to know about it. Yes.
I was just going to ask, I was interested in your comments about the aptitude you mentioned for interpreting, and obviously there must be a complete difference in aptitude for languages and interpreting. When you take people onto your courses in Tokyo, for example, and you give them these aptitude tests, what type of language ability have they got at that stage in terms of fluency in English, for example?
I would, for example, expect this candidate to be able to make a very articulate, eloquent case as to why he wants to take this course.
英語で.
Yes, 英語で and in 日本語で also. Too often I see candidates who come and see me through somebody's introduction and say, 村松さん、私アメリカに5年留学してたんですけど、英語上手だと思うんですけど、通訳になりたいと、I would like to say, sorry, you're wasting your time and mine. But being very courteous, I don't do that. But I know at that moment that he or she will never become an interpreter. Whereas if one can say something like in either Japanese or English, so I spent 1 year while in high school in America, I have acquired what I believe is reasonable fluency, that language, and I'm very interested in intercultural communication, and I believe my background can be some use, and I understand you run a very effective course. Perhaps I can test my own potential. Would you, what would you think, sir? If so, I would like to ask about procedures for, well, yes, he has passed the first test about aptitude. Now, to be fluent in 2 languages, basic 2, like having to have 2 legs to run a race. Having to have 2 arms to play violin. That's such a basic matter. And violin here is equivalent to interpreting technique training. You have to have very alert mind, quick responsiveness. But there are some aptitudes or qualifications not required of an interpreter. So essentially. And I like to emphasize this because I don't like anybody to think that an interpreter is a monster or genius or anything, or freak. We are the people who happen to have certain set of aptitudes, but don't have some others. For example, we don't need to be a good mathematician. we don't need to be very deep philosophers. Ability to philosophize or building a theoretical structure is not so much required. More quick response is required. So I always like to tell my clients who say apologetically, I never learned English. I said, don't worry, leave it to us, professionals. You excel in your own field, business management, or ophthalmology, or think Japanese as foreign language and so on. You should have no complex, no hang-up about not being able to speak English. I like to quote Thomas Alva Edison, who was a very bad mathematician, and said he could not add, he couldn't keep his checkbook balance. But he used to boast that he can always hire a mathematician. And I like to remind my clients that you can always hire us. Okay, sounding much better.
Is there any other questions?
Actually, I didn't have a question. I'd love a short demonstration.
Yes, simultaneous.
Sure.
Yes. Yeah, if someone would stand up and give an improvised speech, to be fair, I think it should be a very general subject. Don't start giving me a lecture on ophthalmology. I didn't interpret the conference. And do it slowly so I can demonstrate how I juxtapose word order. Someone like to?
Maybe.
Do it in Japanese or English, whichever. Well, say something like 本日は a couple of minutes. And maybe word by word, very slowly. 大きな声で。
今日はとても面白い話をしていただいて、
Very
とても
interesting
面白かったです。
presentation has been made,
特に
which we found amusing.
なんていうの同時通訳になる
Especially in order to become a simultaneous interpreter, the question of aptitude is most interesting to us. Something like that. I think I've said everything she has said in quite different word order. But basically, I think I've conveyed everything she wanted to convey. And this was easy because what she said is exactly what I expected she would say anyway. Question of educated guess. She's absolutely unlikely to say things like, I found that the speech by that bald-headed middle-aged man quite boring one. She'll never say it. It's a matter of educated guess. By the way, being a great friend of Australia, and I coined a new word for myself, Australophile. I've written a chapter about Australia, a unique country and its language in my book, and I'm leaving a copy with this. And I've told some amusing stories about Strine. I don't mean to be facetious, I don't mean to joke around, but this is what interests my readers, to read about Australia. There's a story I love of a Japanese shosha trading house man who has just been posted to Sydney. And he had done a lot of serious background study about Australian customs, mores, and language. He learned that Australians tend to systematically pronounce A as I. All right? So he really learned it hard. He's been exercising, practicing. On his first taxi ride in Sydney, he told the cab driver, "Take me to such and such place." And the driver thought it was amusing for this Japanese to imitate the accent. He looked back and said, he started giving him lecture. "Young man, we don't talk like that here," and so on. And this Japanese businessman was frustrated. He was sad. He said, "Well, I did a lot of serious homework. I learned that you tend to systematically change A to I." And the taxi driver was flabbergasted. He said, Jeez, mate, you are well educated. Love this story. And I think Australian people are broad-minded enough to enjoy it.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Bronzer, for the most interesting and informative talk. I tell you, I assure you, how difficult it is to interpret, because I resolved myself never to interpret again because of my experience. And it is an extremely difficult job, because even if you're given the text, some speaker will leave the text and add something else, or change the text, and it's extremely hard. And I attended international conference in Kyoto once, the Japan Pen Club, and I appreciate really the difficulty the interpreters were facing, particularly because I was in the section of religion and philosophy. Well, thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. It was my great pleasure. And just one parting word. I am a born optimist, gregarious man, an extrovert, which are all qualities needed to be a good interpreter. And I wish you the best of luck. And if you achieve such high level of proficiency, you might like to become interpreters. You can join us as our colleagues and partners. If not, you can always be our clients. I divide the whole world into two categories. And in a little more serious tone, if I sound overconfident about everything, I am not. I do think I am basically modest man, because modesty is very important to be a good professional interpreter. Once you begin thinking, I know more than this speaker does, you can never do good interpreting. If he says something beyond your comprehension, you must tell yourself, yes, he is an expert on that subject. The things I don't understand, that is why I can't fully interpret him. Then you go back home and do your more study about the subject. And this finding people with two combinations, basic attitude, gregarious, outgoing, aggressive, positive, extrovert, with proper degree of modesty, it's not easy. Thank you.